Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we have with us Lahav Harkov, who is the Senior Political Correspondent for the Jewish Insider. She was formerly the Diplomatic Correspondent and Senior Contributing Editor to the Jerusalem Post. Lahav, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So there have been a lot of developments in the last few days, of course, with regard to the Israel-Hamas conflict, but now, Israel has told the United Nations to evacuate 1.1 million people in Gaza within the next 24 hours, and a ground offensive seems imminent. What do you expect to happen after these 24 hours?
Like you said, a ground offensive seems imminent. I do think that the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, will probably send ground troops into Gaza. It's a very delicate operation because there are so many hostages, mostly, as far as we know, all civilians, many children, women, elderly people, including Holocaust survivors, are being held by Hamas, over 100 people. There are airstrikes going on in Gaza, but Israel's trying to be very careful, as always, trying not to harm civilians, but also not to harm Israelis who are being held hostage there. So a big part of the operation, I think, will be trying to find these hostages and to bring them home.
Right, because we did see Israel cut off food, medicine, and water to residents in Gaza. And could you perhaps, I know it's not happened as yet, but what do you predict will happen with this ground offensive? I mean, are we going to see an all-out war as it's being predicted by many analysts?
Yeah, I mean, since Israel withdrew from Gaza, and the Palestinians had the opportunity to turn it into the country that they say that they want, and they didn't do that. They elected Hamas, which had turned it into basically a base at which to terrorize southern Israel. And we've had repeated rounds of fighting where they send thousands of missiles into Israel, and then Israel airstrikes back. A couple of times there have been ground troops that have come in, but this is different. I mean, Hamas, over 1,000 members of Hamas came into Israel. They murdered hundreds of people, desecrated the bodies, burned people alive, beheaded children. It's just something else. It's a whole other level that Israel can't just say, we'll do something small for a few days and hope to bring the calm. Israelis understand, and the leadership of Israel understands, that the old paradigm cannot continue and that something has to change. And so the idea is to basically get rid of Hamas entirely. It's not the people of Gaza, right? The people of Gaza are it's true that they voted in Gaza in 2006, but since then they are being ruled by an oppressive terrorist organization, an oppressive Islamist or a terrorist organization. So Israel's not trying to wipe out the people of Gaza, but they do want to get rid of this leadership, and something else will have to come in its place, because living next door to an enclave of 2 million people who are governed by a terrorist entity is not going to work anymore.
And I wanted to speak to you about a little bit of what you said about how Israelis understand where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to take this. You seem to say that there's full support for this ground offensive, should it happen, by the Israeli people. But I also wanted to ask you, since we've been seeing a lot of videos of Likud members being shooed away from hospitals, a Knesset member, David Bitan, berated by people while in a coffee shop. There seems to be a lot of public anger and questions about whether this was a security failure on Israel's part. Obviously,
yes.
Now Israelis will, back the government win this war. But what about after the war? Do you think this public anger will mount after the war and perhaps hurt Netanyahu's political career?
So maybe I wasn't clear. I didn't say that Israelis overwhelmingly support Netanyahu. I'm saying I think Israelis think that the paradigm needs to shift, that the things that have been done since 2006 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, and most of those years Netanyahu was prime minister, those things need to change. This war needs to be different from the other rounds. Now, this is a surprise attack which is always viewed as a failing of our intelligence and of our leadership. But it's also the worst civilian casualties in Israel's history and also in the history of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And so, of course, this is widely viewed as a failing. I think that there will be political consequences. You can already see those people being shouted down. This was a year, though, in which Israel had massive protests. Now, the protests did not necessarily represent most of the country because they came right after the Netanyahu-led government won a pretty resounding victory. They had a very clear majority. But, even if the opposition is only 42% of the country versus 58 or whatever the exact numbers are, that's a lot of people, and hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets protesting. And our society was divided in a way that really had never been seen before. It's beautiful how Israelis have come together now in our time of need to help one another and to fight together. That being said, the anger at the government for what happened is now coming not only from the people who were protesting the government before, but also a lot of people on the right. There was a poll that came out just yesterday that showed 86% of Israelis blame Netanyahu for this. And so I think that, it's a little early to know exactly what will happen, but I do think that there will be far-reaching political consequences as we go forward.
Now, just to speak a little bit on the support that has been extended to Israel by various countries. Over 80 countries have pledged their support to Israel, including India. What is the perspective in Israel when it comes to the support from India? Because we've seen Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi issue a tweet extending full solidarity with Israel, terming these attacks as terror attacks, and then proceeding to have a phone call with Netanyahu. And just yesterday, in fact, the Ministry of External Affairs here in Delhi reiterated India's traditional stance on the conflict, which is its support for an independent Palestinian state and for talks for a two-state solution. What is the response to India's reaction been in Israel?
So first of all, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw a poll that showed that Israel is the country that likes India more than any other country in the world.
Yes.
So Israelis love India. And I think that still remains. I don't think there's any change to that. In terms of, Modi's statement, look, I don't think Israel expects a lot of countries to change their stance on the two-state solution. And in Israel, it shifts. It depends how you ask the question in the polls and things like that. But in Israel, it's about 50-50. About half of Israelis support a two-state solution as well. And Hamas is not the Palestinians, right? Unfortunately, there are many Palestinians who support Hamas. But I think that anyone who supports a two-state solution does not think that it's going to be a two-state solution with Hamas as the leadership of the second state. And so I don't think that the two things are necessarily contradictory.
And if we could sort of move on to something that, in fact, you've written a lot about, which is the US-Israel relationship. In fact, I follow your podcast or your previous podcast with Jerusalem Post quite a bit, where in fact you had Netanyahu on your podcast back in June, where he spoke, you asked him questions about Biden not meeting him in person, not ringing him up, then being very critical of the judicial reforms in Israel. And now we're seeing sort of a complete U-turn from that icy relationship that seemed to have happened has now turned into a full-fledged support from Washington. US is supplying arms to Israel now. What's your take on that shift in a relationship that had a lot of question marks on it?
Yeah, I think that this development has been really interesting. Throughout, even when Biden was avoiding meeting and speaking with Netanyahu because of Netanyahu's domestic politics and because there are extremist figures in Netanyahu's government. I mean, that was when Biden was specifically asked about it, he cited the extremist figures in Netanyahu's government and didn't really mention the judicial reform as much, even though I know it's widely reported in the reverse. But he would still make sure to say that he thinks that Israel is important, that the Jewish people need Israel, that America should support Israel, and also that Israel is a key ally to the U.S. in a tough region. And now we see that he's putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak, that, even if Netanyahu is not someone who he has the best relationship with, he views Israel as a U.S. ally, and he's there and he's supporting Israel. The U.S. is bringing its largest aircraft carrier into the Eastern Mediterranean to show support for Israel and to show Hezbollah in Lebanon that, they shouldn't test us. And the U.S. is sending artillery to Israel and is, as we speak, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is in Israel. Yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel. So, even though I think that there were some doubts this year and there were some thoughts that the U.S.-Israel relationship was experiencing tensions that might damage the relationship, Biden is showing that the U.S. has Israel's back.
I'm glad you brought up Hezbollah because do you think by the US bringing in its largest aircraft carrier, is it sending a message to Hezbollah should this ground offensive begin? Basically what I'm trying to ask is, if this ground offensive begins, how likely is there a two-front war with Lebanon to the north of Israel?
That's the big question. I think nobody except for maybe Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran know the answer to that. Certainly the US and Israel have warned Hezbollah, and I think Hezbollah knows that actually Israel was caught sort of by surprise by Hamas. But a war with Hezbollah is something that Israel has been expecting since the last one ended in 2006. Israel is extremely prepared for that war. Right now, 300,000 reserve soldiers were called up, including my husband. They're all there. They're all serving. And many of them were sent up to Israel's northern border. Israel is ready if Hezbollah is going to attack. But the hope is that they are properly deterred by the U.S. bringing the aircraft carrier, by the fact that Israel is much more prepared in the north than it was for what happened in the south.
And, what do you think about the fate, the Iran nuclear deal or the JCPOA? Are those talks for an Iran nuclear deal sort of dead in the water at this point?
I think the JCPOA has been dead for a long time. The Biden administration tried to revive it. There were talks, but those have been dead for a while. And they went for like a sort of secondary, a much more minor deal, which was sort of a hostage exchange, and then a pause to the Iran nuclear program in exchange for thawing certain funds that were frozen in sanctions. Right now, that thaw has been maybe not fully reversed, but partially reversed. Essentially, the money went from South Korea to Qatar. Qatar was supposed to transfer the money to Iran, but now Qatar has agreed not to do that, which is interesting. We'll see if that stays holding forward. But right now, Qatar's agreed. I think that the U.S. has said that it is examining Iran's involvement. The European Union has said that it is going to reevaluate its relationship with Iran. They all know that Iran funds 93% of Hamas's money. I mean, people talk a lot about Qatar funding Hamas, and Qatar funds Hamas too, but really Qatar gives a lot of humanitarian aid to Gazans. Now, that does keep Hamas afloat, because if Gazans were really, really starving and the humanitarian situation was, the worst, then I imagine Hamas wouldn't be there anymore. I think they would rise up. But Iran is the one, I think, who it really holds the responsibility for Hamas having these capabilities and these weapons that were used to attack Israel, some of which were weapons that Israel did not know that Hamas has, and that the IDF has found these weapons and found that they are Iranians. There's also video evidence of people speaking Farsi on the day of the attack of Israel. So there may have been Iranians on the ground. That's something that I know that is being looked into by intelligence services in Israel. But if we go back to the JCPOA, all these countries as allies of Israel are now reevaluating their Iran policy. There's something, ironic to it. I mean, I think Israel has been warning about this all the time. The fact that they've been funding Hamas and the fact that Hamas wants to kill Israelis is something that they always knew. And if only they could have done something before instead of after the fact.
And lastly, Lahav, I must ask you about the big geopolitical question that hovers over this conflict, which is Israel's talks with Saudi Arabia for normalization of ties. A lot of people, a lot of analysts have said Hamas sort of is trying to establish its relevance or sort of derail these talks and say, if Fatah is being consulted in these talks, we want a seat as well at the table. Where do you see the talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia for normalization of ties going?
I mean, first of all, if Hamas wanted a seat at anybody's table except Iran's, and maybe North Korea's, they shouldn't have done what they did on Saturday, because no self-respecting country in the Brotherhood of Nations is going to sit at a table with Hamas after this. I mean, this is ISIS level, right? And nobody wanted to touch ISIS. Nobody wanted to be an ally of ISIS. And Hamas is behaving exactly like ISIS behaved. Saudi Arabia, they put I wouldn't say it's a neutral statement, but it was not a condemnation the way you see in the Western world, nor the way you saw in India and other countries that are allies of Israel. But they certainly weren't supporting Hamas. So I don't think that's the result. Now, that being said, I do think this is going to put a damper or slow down the process of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel's just not going to have the bandwidth to deal with it while it's at war. And then Saudi Arabia is going to have to consider its own people and how they'll respond to normalization in a timing like this. At the same time, it's really very strongly in the Saudi interest to normalize with Israel, not only because the U.S. is promising all kinds of benefits like a defense pact, and well, they're negotiating it. I shouldn't say they promised it, but even those things are on the table, right? So, and they have a good relationship with Israel, helps with their intelligence, helps with their technological development. There's all kinds of areas in which Saudi Arabia wants to cooperate with Israel. So I think down the line, there's a good chance that it will pick up again, but it may take some time.
Well, thank you, Lahav, for taking out the time to shed some light on this important conflict. Please take care. We'll be in touch with you and monitoring the situation.